So the Bible is a book of hope. We know this. It's a book that is filled with stories of love, power, faith, and glory. It is a book that has a message of grace and peace and salvation, redemption and miracles. It has it all for us. But the Bible is also a book filled with seemingly impossible, hopeless situations. And in many of these stories, there seems to be no solution, no way out. Storms, needs, deaths, sickness, and many other problems appear throughout the ages, but that to the human mind are impossible, yet time after time, these situations are handled with ease by the power of God. It's nothing to Him. And it seems everything to us, but it's nothing to Him. One of those stories is in the text we have read today that details a hopeless situation in the life of a woman named Hagar. And this is the way I've always said the name, but I'm going to defer to my wife because Hagar was Egyptian, and she says the correct pronunciation is Hagar. So I'll defer to that. I'll try to get in the habit of saying that. The story opens in the home of a man named Abraham, who may have been the father of the faithful, but his family was a shambles. It was a mess. And, we talked about families this morning in Bible class and marriage, but we look at Genesis chapter 16 and in verses 1 through 6. And we begin to read about this. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go in to my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. Then Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me." So Abram said to Sarai, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. So this arrangement, initiated by Sarai, not Abram, but this arrangement did nothing but cause trouble for Abraham. Sarah was jealous of Hagar and her baby, and Hagar was jealous of Sarah and her relationship with Abraham. And Abraham is caught in the middle trying to please two women, which is an absolute impossibility, so to speak, not in this situations such as these. And by the way, our world is still paying for the price for these foolish choices. And none of it would have happened had it not been for the choice of Sarai and Abraham agreeing to it in the first place. So it became a mess. And it wasn't intended to be this way. We look in Matthew chapter 19, and we know what Jesus said when it comes to husband and wife. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 4. "And he answered and said to them, Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. And they said to him, Then why did command Moses' command to give a certificate of divorce. And he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. In other words, this was not God's intention. Two are to become one flesh, not three. That's not even possible. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. And in our text, things have come to a head. There is an all-out, you could say there is an all-out civil war in Abraham's tent, in his home. And as a result, Hagar finds herself in a desperate situation. And in the midst of that terrible time, she has a powerful personal encounter with God himself. Now, the first time was in Genesis chapter 16 that she was ran out, and then she was told to go back. And that was before Ishmael was even born. But now it's happening again, which is what we want to talk about this morning. Out of Hagar's pain comes a ray of hope, and that we'll see in this situation for all those who find themselves in the hard, harsh places of life that seem so unfair. And regardless of what the arena of life, and despite the fact that they may have been fully responsible for causing the mess in the first place, which we can be. Many times we find ourselves in a mess. It's not our fault, but many times it is. But even then, I want you to see that God can take your hopeless situation, even if you're the one that created it, if you just turn to him, and he'll turn it around for his glory. He can do it, while simultaneously sheltering you under his wing. He can do it. Only he can do that when everything else seems so hopeless. I want to focus on the question the Lord asked Hagar in verse 17 of chapter 21. And God heard the voice of the lad, and the angel of God called to Hagar out of heaven and said to her, What ails you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. And God asked her, What ails you, Hagar? What's wrong? And if we have an ailment like she did, regardless of what it may be, he has a word of hope for us, just as he did with her here. There is a remedy for reversal to turn things around. And man doesn't hold that remedy in his hands. It's only God. There's a cure for your condition. So let's consider the lessons that present themselves in this passage in chapter 21 as we examine the case of what we call this broken-hearted woman. Her heart was broken. And in verses 9 through 14 of chapter 21, and Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, scoffing. Therefore she said, and this is what started it to begin with. This is when everything came to a head. Therefore she said to Abraham, Cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Isaac. And the matter was very displeasing in Abraham's sight because of his son. But God said to Abraham, Do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. Yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and the skin of water, and putting it on her shoulder, he gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. Then she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. She was wandering in the wilderness. Have you ever felt that way, that you're wandering in a wilderness, so to speak? I have, and I think many of you probably have. You feel lost, kicked out of your home, which is what happened to her. So it was a time of harsh rejection. Things had been tense in Abraham's tent for many years. And in this passage, Isaac is about 3 years old and Ishmael is about 17. So they're quite a bit of difference in age. But Ishmael's old enough and he's mocking him. And they are celebrating as Isaac matures from a baby to a little boy. And this probably brings it more to Ishmael's mind about what's happened, that he's receiving the blessing. So things come to a head and during this feast. And Hagar faces a terrible time of rejection when Sarah has had enough. And the reasons we can see in verses 9 and 10, Ishmael was mocking and he was making fun of Isaac at the festivities, at this festivity. And the word mocking, ironically, is a strong form of the name Isaac itself, which means laughter. Ishmael saw all hopes of inheritance dashed in Isaac. This was not good-natured kidding and joking around with your brother. This was malicious and mean-spirited. And he just kept it up, and he kept doing it more and more, and it was worse. And he knew that Isaac was the son of promise and that he was just the son of a slave, but a little 3-year-old boy is not going to understand that. But he did. He realized that he would never be anything more than he was at this moment. He's jealous of him, so he acts out during the feast. And Sarah sees this, and after building up rage for so long over the years, she finally explodes and demands that Hagar and Isaac be sent away, or Hagar and Ishmael be sent away. The phrase cast out means to drive away, but only Abraham can do this. Sarah cannot do it herself, although she's the one that initiates it. Although Sarah was no angel here, to mock Isaac was a serious matter to God. So we have to admit that. To mock him was to mock God's people. Isaac was the one through whom the nation of Israel would come, and that the Messiah would come later, Jesus. To mock God's people and to mock his promise. Isaac was the son of promise. He was the miracle baby in Sarah's old age. She was too old to have a baby, but she had one anyway. Mock God's power. Isaac came into the world because God was greater than old age, dead wombs, and the abilities of men. It was beyond that. He intervened, as he did so many times for the line of the Messiah to come, Jesus. And he was doing it again here. He was mocking God's provision. It would be through Isaac that Jesus would come into the world. So this was a bigger deal than just a feud and jealousy between two women. As we read about in the scripture reading this morning, this goes down through the ages and the difference between laws. And in verses 11 through 14, we see the realities of this rejection. Abraham was a rich man. She was living a good life. But here we see that Abraham is reluctant to do what Sarah is demanding. And after all, it would be against all human sensibilities and against the norms of decent society. And Abraham loved her, and he loved Ishmael. This was a bad situation. Yet God tells him that it is part of his plan for both Isaac and Ishmael to separate. For Abraham, this is as real as it gets. He's forced to send away his oldest son and that son's mother, and it broke his heart to send them away. The word grievous means to tremble or quiver, and this event shook Abraham to his very core. He did not take this lightly. There is no doubt that he loved Ishmael and that he certainly had feelings for Hagar. And it was a hard morning for Abraham and a hard day. But Abraham had done this before, and he would do it again, because he put God first. It was an even harder morning that was coming, because in next chapter, in chapter 22, and God will command Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on a mountain in the land of Moriah. Do you think God lets up and makes it easy? No. It's actually just the opposite. And so many times we focus on that chapter, that popular story about Isaac, and fail to realize that Abraham has already suffered trauma. Already, before he's even went through that with Isaac at the altar. With another son, before this one even took place with Isaac. We fail to realize that he's already been through trauma when he took Isaac. Which makes his display of faith in being willing to sacrifice Isaac at that point even more amazing. Abraham honored the Lord in both cases, and he did what the Lord told him to do, even though it was tearing him apart. And sometimes that's what we have to do. Even if something is tearing us apart, if it is God's will and it pleases Him, you do it anyway. And he did. Sending Ishmael away was merely preparation for greater service. And if Abraham had refused to give up Ishmael, this was also a test. Again, we talk about the test with Isaac, the test with Ishmael, it was also a test. But if he had refused, it is likely he would have never been willing to give up Isaac. He could have failed both tests. We all know that life can be like that at times. And things are going well one moment, and the next thing we know, we're on our backs looking up, wondering, how did I get here? Because that's how fast it can happen. Everything seemed to be going so well. This life is filled with hard realities and heartbreaking moments. Let's not kid ourselves. Job chapter 1 and verse 6. Now there was a day, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also among them. And verses 9 through 11, so Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, around all that he has on every side? And you have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And in chapter 2 and in verse 1, and again, there was a day. So we're talking about there was a day, and there was a day about his character. And now in chapter 2, there was another day, again, when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. Do you think Satan's going to give up? There's going to be a day with us. There was a day with Abraham. There was a day again with Ishmael. There was a day again with Abraham and Isaac. There's a day with us again and again and again. He's not going to give up. He's not, until it's the end. We can't give up. And in verse 4 of chapter 2, so Satan answered the Lord and said, skin for skin, yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life. But he was wrong. Job overcame it. We have to overcome it. Satan can be wrong. Why? Because he's wrong to begin with. Don't give up. Abraham didn't. Each time it is said, and there was a day. But in our lives, here's the hard part. Here's the easy part, standing up here and saying it. The hard part is walk out those doors and live it. This is nothing to say it. This is nothing to talk about it. This is nothing to nod our heads and agree. Yes, 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 we agree. Yes, we're going to do that. Well, it's a lot harder when you actually have to do it. When sickness comes, people die, relationships fall apart, churches disintegrate, finances fail, depression rears its head, difficulties arise, troubles dog our steps. It seems that it never ends. And the reason for that is because it doesn't. It's as simple as that. He's not going to give up. In Job chapter 14 and in verse 1, man who is born of woman is of a few days and full of trouble. Just face it and stop thinking it's going to stop. It's not. And you'll do much better, actually, when you accept it. He'll return again and again and again and again. And again, he won't stop until it's over. And we can't stop. In Job chapter 5 and in verse 7, yet man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. The sparks fly upward. It's never-ending turmoil in one way or another. There's times of rest, but there's times he's not going to stop. And in John chapter 16, and in verse 33, we read this in the same way where Jesus said, John chapter 16 and verse 33, these things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So the only way we can get through it is Jesus. That's it. And the only way Hagar was going to get through this in the wilderness was God. That's it. That is why Joseph Parker, a London minister in the 1800s, said, speak to suffering and you will never lack an audience. Every one of you can relate to what I'm saying. You will never lack an audience. There is a broken heart in every crowd. And sometimes it's yours when you're speaking. You know what the sad thing is? Many preachers have forgotten that. They're often too busy. They get bogged down in preaching only certain pet topics of theirs rather than the whole counsel of God. And the people are starving. Or trying to deal with squabbles within the congregation instead of to remember that members are just trying to get through life. And come to services hungry for that in a sermon. They're just trying to get through this life as a Christian. And it seems like many preachers have forgotten that, and they need your help. In Genesis chapter 21, in verse 15 and 16, it was a time of hopeless realities for Hagar. There were problems, but if he cared so much for them, why did Abraham send them away with just a bottle of water and a little bread when he had the resources to see that all their needs were met? He could have sent her away, a rich woman. Why did he do that? Well, knowing Abraham and his tremendous faith, it may have been because he was taking God at his word and knew that God would take care of her. And he was right. They were in a desperate situation, but that's how life can be at times. Look in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Second Corinthians chapter 1 and verses 8 through 10. For we do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, of our trouble which came to us in Asia, that we were burdened beyond, Paul says, beyond measure. You couldn't measure how much they were burdened and persecuted. Above strength, so that we despaired even of life. We wanted to die. Yes, we have had the sentence of a death in ourselves, that we should not trust in ourselves, but in God who raises the dead, who delivered us from so great a death and does deliver us, in whom we trust that He will still deliver us. The word measure in that verse means to throw beyond. It's beyond what we can handle. And that's why so many people in this world have fallen apart and even given up their lives, taken their own lives, because they try to do it on their own without God. God took Paul beyond what Paul was able to handle within himself, and He can do it with us. Sometimes the burdens of life are more than we can bear. And even when the burdens of life exceed our ability to bear them, they never exceed His. When I was in the Air Force and I was stationed in Korea, we had a church there on base, and there was a young woman visiting one time, and she had some horrible problems, and she told us about them. And I said, how can you handle that? I mean, how do you go ahead? And she says, I can't. She said, I just hand it over to God because I can't do it. And that was her whole point. Praise God. Even when the load gets too heavy, remember He is in the yoke with you. There was pain. Hagar's heart is broken. Remember this. This isn't just a physical threat. Her heart is broken at the same time. On top of that, she is sure her son Ishmael is going to die. I'm not sure why, but he's worse than her. And I would say there's a good chance that he would have. She leaves him under a bush, and she goes away because she does not want to witness the death of her son. We read about it in verse 16. It had gotten that bad. She was convinced he was going to die, and she said, I don't even want to see it. That's how bad it was. But she went a bow shot away about 1,000 feet, about 1,000 feet. And Hagar leaves Ishmael there, and she goes off to weep because she simply did not know what else to do. She found herself in a situation that she could not fix, from which she could not escape. She was at the end of her rope. Have you ever been there? When all you can do is cry. Well, David found himself in a hopeless place, and it says that he wanted to fly away. And that's probably how she felt. In Psalm chapter 55 and verses 4 through 8, my heart is severely pained within me, and the terrors of death have fallen upon me. Fearfulness and trembling have come upon me, and horror has overwhelmed me. So I said, oh, that I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. Indeed, I would wander far off and remain in the wilderness. I would hasten my escape from the windy storm and the tempest. And that's probably how she felt. She just wanted to fly away. Most of us like to be in control of our lives, and we like to think that we are, but in fact, we're not. And sometimes it's more apparent to us than other times in situations such as these. But when we're not in control and we feel like we can't fix it, then we become desperate or we become angry, and then we turn away from God rather than toward Him when we need Him the most. And of course, Hagar shouldn't have been worried. She had the promise of God that He was going to make Ishmael the father of a great nation. And He did. He wasn't going to die out there in that wilderness, because God had already made a promise. In that moment of desperation, Hagar's pain blinded her to God's promise. Have you ever been there? You know He said it, but you're blind. The fact is, sometimes life hurts. And sometimes it hurts really bad. And when it does, we want to run away from our problems and from our pain. And what we fail to see is that our pain is the path that God is using to fulfill His promises. And if we can learn to trust Him even when we can't trace Him, He will grant us peace in times of pain. He will. There was prayer. We don't know if she prayed or not, but it's obvious that Ishmael did. God heard him and moved to help him. Incidentally, the name, just like Isaac was laughter, the name Ishmael means God hears. See how perfectly that works out? Prayer is an ever-present resource for the believer. We can run to Him anytime, anywhere, for any purpose, and He has promised to hear us and help us. Jeremiah 33 and verse 3, call to me, and I will answer you and show you great and mighty things which you do not know. He's just saying, call on Him, I'll show you things you didn't even dream of. Prayer should always be our first priority, not the last resort, as we too often do. Okay, everything else failed. I guess I'll try praying. It's not supposed to work that way. Here's the truth. Problems are going to come in our lives. When they do, they will come unwanted and unannounced. We don't invite them. Well, sometimes we do with our behavior, but not consciously. And when they come, they will hurt us deeply at times. And when they come, we must not delay, but we must run to the Lord. He will hear us. He will help us. He may change the situation, but even more and more importantly, He will change us in the situation if we allow Him. Just in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verses 9 and 10, where Paul asked him to remove the thorn that was in his side, whatever that was, and the answer was no, and Paul was like, okay, now I rejoice in this. The difference between Paul's attitude in trouble and my own is that I have not yet reached the place where I openly welcome trouble. Do any of us actually do that? Instead, we often despise it and we become weak in faith. The exact opposite of what God wants is when He told Paul, my strength is made perfect in weakness. We should actually invite and welcome it. And if it's unavoidable, that we know we're going to get closer to God. And that was Paul's attitude. Many years ago, A.W. Tozer said, "The devil, things, and people being what they are, it is necessary for God to use the hammer, the files, and the furnace in his holy work of preparing a saint for true sainthood. It is doubtful whether God can bless a man greatly until he has let him be hurt deeply." And that's not on God's side, that's us. It's because of us. That sometimes that's what it takes to realize how much He loves us. It was a time of hidden resources. As we see, we finish in verses 17 through 21. She didn't realize it, but God was there and He had just what He needed to see her through it. And God had a plan in all of this. Here, even in Galatians 4, as we read it in the scripture reading, Paul even speaks of this episode as an illustration of salvation. That Sarah is a picture of the grace of God, the line of Christ. Hagar is a picture of the law of works. Isaac is a picture of faith. Ishmael is a picture of the flesh. Ishmael represented the efforts of the flesh, and he had to go so that the son of the faith, Isaac, might obtain his rightful place. But God was using these events in the lives of Abraham and Isaac while He still lovingly caring for this poor Egyptian woman and her son in the middle of a wilderness. Think about that. Our God was also connected with the plan of salvation for all mankind, and He loves and cares for this woman and her son in the wilderness. What ails you? Bring it to Him now and let Him show you that He knows who you are. We read about that in John chapter 10 and verse 27. "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." Realize God's presence, that He's here for you. And if you're separated from Him, it's because of you, not Him. Hagar didn't know it, but God had been there the whole time, just like He is with us. And sometimes we forget that. By the way, He won't leave you either. As a faithful child of God, you will... Listen, think about this. As a child of God, you will never live 1 second. Your heart will never beat once. You will never take one breath. You will never take one step in this world without Him being there for you. He's here for you this morning. And maybe you've forgotten that. And maybe you've reminisced this morning and you look back and remember being in the wilderness like Hagar. And maybe you got closer to God, or maybe you didn't. But now's your chance to do it again. So whatever that need might be, we invite you to examine yourself and think of this poor woman with her son, and know that how much God loves you just as much as He did her and Ishmael. And we invite you to come while together we stand and sing.